I want to talk for a minute about the Ed Buck case and share with you information that will give you some insight as to what the district attorney's office has done. I'm very limited in what I can say about the case by the law because the case is still pending, both in state court and in federal court. I want to say something I should have said a long time ago. I'm sorry to the Moore family and the Dean family for the loss of their loved ones. Meth is the most prevalent drug in our society, in our particular community. And we're having a hard time getting those people who are addicted to methamphetamine help. I want to talk for a minute just about our filing criteria and what's required, because I think that will help you understand what happened in the Buck case. In order to file a criminal case, we have to have legally sufficient and admissible evidence. And we have to have evidence of the identity of the perpetrator, and we have to make sure that the investigation is complete and thorough. Finally, after looking at the prosecution's case, we have to look at not just the evidence proving guilt, but also look at any sort of defense that may be plausible given our evidence. Here is the posture that we found ourselves in the Jamel Moore case.
Jamel.
Sorry. Jamel Moore.
Learn his name. That's basic respect.
Jamel Moore, I'm sorry. We had to prove under state law that Buck injected meth into Mr. Moore and that resulted in his death. With regard to Mr. Dean, we had to prove also in that case that Buck injected Mr. Dean with the methamphetamine that resulted in his death. In both cases, Buck called the emergency personnel, and he appeared to attempt to administer AIDS. He gave very self-serving statements that could not initially be rebutted by the physical evidence. When Mr. Moore was found dead, the original sheriff's deputies on the case were not homicide deputies. They were deputies from the station. And at first, they treated it as though it were an overdose. They noticed around Mr. Moore's body that there was a red toolbox. And they wanted to search that toolbox for evidence. A coroner's investigator gave them information that turned out to be incorrect. He said that according to the government code, that they were allowed to look in that toolbox for evidence. The government code does not permit law enforcement to use that code. Instead, what it says is that if you're a coroner, you can look around, or a coroner's investigator, you can look around for the person's personal effects. As a matter of fact, there's case law that particularly precludes law enforcement from using any evidence in that toolbox. Inside the red toolbox was methamphetamine, and it was the only methamphetamine that was in that house at the time. So that presented a challenge, and we continued to look for evidence in this case. At some point, we began to hear that there were more victims of Mr. Buck. However, when those victims were interviewed, after being granted immunity, there were things that we couldn't corroborate because we knew that they were going to be cross-examined about some of the things that they said. For instance, sometimes a victim would say that he received medical treatment at a particular hospital, and we would go to that hospital and not be able to get those medical records. In another case, we would have a victim who said, I made a police report, and we couldn't find any record of that police report. It wasn't until that third credible witness came forward that we caught a break in this case. In the meantime, before that third victim came forward, the federal government, the FBI, and the DEA began working with the Sheriff's Department to see if they could prove a case under federal law. Because under federal law, you would not have needed to prove that Buck injected either of these gentlemen. You would just need to prove that he furnished the drugs. The third victim, as I mentioned, came forward, and he was indeed credible. He came forward with information that we were able to corroborate, and of course, we knew that he would be able to testify. It was then that we filed our case against Mr. Buck, and we filed the charges that were available to us from the evidence. The charges that we filed were a maximum sentence of 5 years and 8 months. And the bail, the maximum bail, was going to be $4 million. After searching Mr. Buck's home and other things during his arrest, we discovered that $4 million bail, $4 million, he was able to make that bail, and we did not want him out. About that time, the feds decided they would go ahead with their case, and they asked us to relinquish Mr. Buck's body so they could prosecute their case. In their case, they did not have to prove that Mr. Buck injected either of these gentlemen, but rather, all they had to prove is that he was furnishing the drugs. Further, their charge under federal law is 20 years to life, a maximum, plus there was no bail. It was at that point we elected not to hold Mr. Buck in state custody and relinquish Mr. Buck to the feds. You will note, though, that the feds also had problems in the sense that originally, in their complaint, they said they had 10 victims. But when the grand jury indicted, there were only 5 victims. Nevertheless, the case continues, and we are holding our case in the event they are not able to convict Mr. Buck.
Were any of the sheriff's deputies involved in the Ed Buck criminal investigation on the Brady or recurring officer witness list for false reporting?
I don't want
Think
to
carefully.
give you something that I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Her index card wasn't ready. Her index card wasn't ready for that answer.
Well, since she don't know the answer to that question, ask the next question. But she don't know the answer.
We file the case, we run it. I'm not the trial lawyer on the case.
But it's your office.
I can give
That's
you
why
The
the
buck
buck
stops with you.
When can you get back? Let's put a date on that.
back with you this evening.
In 3 years?
Okay.
She can't answer anything because they so corrupt.
Next question.